of the two, quagga is the more adaptable and the more scarier threat of the two, but both could be pretty devastating. So that's really what drove the creation of the Aquatic Invasive Species Program. We piloted it in 2013 and really strengthened our legislation and had a full program established in 2015. So we're pretty new program, but doing some pretty big things with a small staff, dedicated staff. And just to give you an idea of where mussels are, very well established, it is in Eastern North America. Ontario and Manitoba are the closest Canadian provinces that we fear that they will be moved from, and it's mostly boats that are transporting mussels. So they do attach to hard surfaces, and they can live out of water for up to 30 days, so they can easily travel across Canada, even the US, and become introduced here in Alberta. That's not the only thing that we're concerned with. There are some weird and wacky things that I get called on. You never know what an email or a phone call will involve in my line of work. So some of the other species that are weird and wacky that we've been faced with is we actually had to respond to somebody driving a bunch of tilapia out to Elbow River and dumping them in the river. We believe that they probably likely all died upon introduction because they are pretty warm water fish, and the Elbow River was quite cold at the time of introduction. But we were concerned about any disease or pathogens that the tilapia may have been carrying with them on that introduction and what they could have done to our native fisheries. So these were probably dumped from some aquaculture facility. So it's very concerning. These folks should know better, but we had to respond to that. We got a call from the Calgary International Airport. We got a shipment of Chinese mitten crabs. And this is exactly how they were shipped. They were declared as TV lights in their declaration of import, obviously not TV lights. They were alive, and they actually fell under Canadian Food Inspection Agency's jurisdiction because there is concerns of human health concerns if they were consumed. So there is a lung fluke that could pass on to humans when consumed. So yeah, the Calgary International Airport intercepted those, and there were similar shipments across the US as well as Canada. This is my office pet. I actually now have 4 of these grove snails or brown-lipped snails. We did get a snail that was found on some nursery shipment from the United Kingdom. It had evaded all inspections and happened to, arrive healthy and happy in Alberta. This one probably wouldn't overwinter in Alberta, so it's not really a major concern, but it is thriving and doing quite well in BC and considered an invasive species there. This is a giant African land snail, which is also a pet, but has since passed away. It was brought to Alberta as a shell. So somebody went to Hawaii and thought it was a beautiful shell and picked it up, brought it home, put it on their coffee table, and then the next day it had crawled across the table. So they got worried of what they had brought home, called us. We actually confiscated it, and with a permit were able to retain it. But it is very concerning. It does eat stucco and like crazy stuff in Hawaii. So quite devastating to infrastructure and vegetation in Hawaii. Wouldn't overwinter here, but it just shows how quickly and easy things can get moved around. This is an American bullfrog. The University of Alberta was doing some research on tadpoles and actually imported one that had a weird look to it. They grew it out just trying to figure out what kind of a species it was, and it did turn out to be an American bullfrog that snuck in with a bunch of other tadpoles that were what they meant to import. We also kept this one as an office pet until it passed away, just to show how easily things get moved around as well. And then last but not least, an octopus was reported to us. So we were never able to get the physical sample to confirm that it was an octopus. We just got a picture that was shared through Facebook, but it does look like a table, and the snow in the background does seem to fit that it might have been at Lake McGregor, and that's where they pulled it out. So octopuses are saltwater and they wouldn't survive in freshwater, but somebody tried to introduce it in Lake McGregor regardless. So you just never know what people are moving around and doing. So this is a snapshot of Alberta and all the known aquatic invasive species locations. Multiple types of species here. We have fish, plants, invertebrates all showcased. We have some significant populations around the Edmonton and Calgary area because of the urban population, more people, more chance of introductions. And we have some fairly substantial populations of Prussian carp in the Red Deer River. Those are the blue dots that starting to be trailing from Red Deer. Prussian carp is very much established in the Red Deer River. And those light pink ones in the South Saskatchewan Bow River is flowering rush. But I will go into most of these species a little bit more later. So we devised this Alberta Aquatic Invasive Species Program to stay ahead of some of these introductions. We have a 5-pillar program where we rely on policy and legislation, education and outreach, monitoring. You've probably heard of some watercraft inspections and decontaminations. And when all that stuff fails, then we're actually responding to aquatic invasive species that have been introduced. And it looks like a really simple pillar, but it is leveraging quite a few folks once you get everybody accounted for. The program is quite extensive, and it's really supported only with 2 full-time staff that are dedicated to aquatic invasive species within the government of Alberta. So we beg, borrow, and plead for support as much as possible. So just going quickly through all the pillars, policy and legislation. Like I said, we piloted our program in 2013, really strengthened our legislation and kind of launched the full program in 2015. We went from 2 prohibited species to 52 and included plants, which was pretty advanced at the time. We made those watercraft inspection stations mandatory in 2015 and really enhanced our authority to quarantine and lock down boats or lakes or rivers or whatever we needed to for response. We've been improving on our legislation. 2016, we added pulling the plug. So anytime you travel with the watercraft with the bilge plug, it has to be removed, otherwise you can be fined. And we also made it mandatory to report any aquatic invasive species that you may encounter, because as soon as we know, it gives us the best chance of success for eradication if that's possible, or containment. And then we did have powers to lay fines in 2015, but to uphold those fines, we had to go to court, and officers were reluctant to lay fines because they don't like to go to court unless they have to. So in 2018, we made 2 specified penalties, much like a speeding ticket. So it's now $324 if you're caught bypassing a watercraft inspection station with a watercraft. And it's $180 if you fail to pull the plug and transport your boat with that bilge plug in. We're also gearing up for major response efforts, like if invasive mussels were detected in Alberta, we need sort of a plan of action of what would we do, who would be involved. So we were able to create an aquatic invasive species early detection rapid response plan, and it really lays out who would be involved and the steps that we would go through in addressing that threat. We detected whirling disease, a fish disease, in 2016, and with that, it really drove the importance of decontamination of equipment prior to moving from water body to water body. So we were able to get this decontamination protocol in place for government staff, and then anyone contracting under a government contract was also required to do this. And then just in 2020, we were able to get industry to buy in So anyone doing construction work is now required to basically clean, drain, and dry their equipment to ensure that whirling disease, as well as other aquatic invasive species, that are not being transported from water body to water body. From there, we go to education outreach. We have clean, drain, dry your gear and don't let it loose as our two main campaigns. These were, really invested to really move from awareness to action. So you don't even have to know any details about species. As long as you're clean, drain, and drying your gear, that's all you have to do to know the actions you have to take. And then the don't let it loose is targeted towards the intentional release of species in the aquatic environments. You will see, this is our old logo, this one here, don't let it loose, with a few key species. You will see a new logo starting to be launched. This campaign is going national. And so the Department of Fisheries and Oceans supported the development of some graphics. And so these are the new Canadian national standards. And they are targeting 5 industries. So the goldfish outline targets pet trade. The small fish is targeting bait fish. The big open fish, open mouth fish is sport fish, intentional release. The plant is water garden release. And the crab depicts live food release. So those are all the 5 pathways that we're addressing through our Don't Let It Loose. From there, we go into monitoring. This is probably the least supported element of the program. We're only able to really monitor for spiny water flea and zebra quagga mussels. So we're quite limited in the species we're actually looking for, but thankfully, even up until this year, we are still negative. There is no spiny water flea or mussels being detected in Alberta. In 2019, we were able to add a Eurasian water milfoil, and this did continue in 2020. So this is the only plant that we're actively looking for. In 2019, we got up to about 37. About the same number of lakes in 2020, and confirmed that all our milfoil is actually just the native. But Eurasian water milfoil is present in BC, and we have intercepted fragments on boats coming in from BC. So all you need is a fragment of the stem to start an Eurasian water milfoil population. So we're on the look for it, at least now that we know we don't have it in some of our water bodies, but that hopefully that will continue. This is where the citizen science campaign. So we have some limited monitoring capacity, so we can leverage citizen science. So we've instituted the Alberta Invasive Species Council to help us implement this. And so they've adopted EDD maps. And this is a US-based smartphone application as well as online. You just sign up and fill out a profile, and then you can submit terrestrial weeds. We're adding other pest species like boars and rats. It's a fairly comprehensive, legislatively driven prohibited list for Alberta, and aquatic invasive species are on there as well. So there's info on and pictures on what to look for, and then it does take the exact location that you're standing in when you make the report. And any aquatic invasive species reports comes to me for verification, so it works pretty slick. So I encourage, if you want to get active on looking for invasive species, to download the ED maps. It's available both on the Apple Store as well as Google Play for Androids. Watercraft inspections is the next pillar. In 2020, we were only operating the 3 eastern stations, Cold Lake, Vermilion, and Dunmore. We did have plans in place to launch Carway, Del Bonita, and Coots, but with the international border never opening, with COVID-19 restrictions, we actually never did open those stations, but we did have personnel ready to launch if that announcement ever did come, but it never came. It still remains closed. So we have those, and the Dunmore is a black dot because it ran nearly 24 hours most of the boat operating season. So and it actually still is functioning to some limited hours today. So we are still trying to inspect boats that are coming across from the east. So here's our program and how we've kind of, ramped up. In 2016, Montana detected some invasive mussels in 2 water bodies. So we got a little boost of money trying to help, put up our defenses a little bit stronger. And then we've kind of dwindled a little bit with some budget reductions. So in 2020, we only did just over 7,000 inspections, but we did a record number of boat inspections where we actually intercepted 30 mussel-foul boats, and that was only operating those 3 inspection stations. So people were definitely traveling more across Canada than we had previously experienced with those international borders being open. We are also pretty innovative in that we have 3 mussel sniffing dogs that are Government of Alberta employees. So we have Hilo, the black lab, Zeus is our German Shepherd, and then the chocolate lab is Diesel. We added them in 2015. The irrigation districts was really responsible for starting this program and bringing the dogs to us, and we've been able to upkeep and keep them trained ever since. So they've done mostly boat inspections when they first started. We've now added shoreline capacity, so they actually can detect the small microscopic mussels in water. And so they are doing some shoreline inspections throughout the summer as well. We're also collaborating to help make sure that we can keep them. They're trained on detecting Thesium, invasive plant in Fish Creek Park. They can smell and detect that pretty hard to find visually plant for the Fish Creek. And they are also now partnering with Wild Boar program, trying to find boar scat in winter in their off season. So pretty innovative. Dogs are amazing creatures, and they can really follow their nose and are quite effective in that manner. Moving on to response. So when all those, policy, legislation, education, outreach, monitoring, and inspections fail, sometimes things do break through and we have to respond. So if anybody sees anything weird and wacky, we have a 24 hours, 7 days a week hotline. It's essentially the same operators that the Report a Poacher uses. So you will get an operator no matter when you call this number. We encourage public, other jurisdictions. The border uses this number. The inspectors, the operators are able to triage calls. And if an officer, a Fish and Wildlife officer, needs to be dispatched, we can do that fairly fast and effective. And it's really all about getting that early detection and rapid response in play. We're very much driven by that invasive mussel scare. So we don't have a lot of control options at our disposal for invasive mussels, but it is well known that fertilizer, potash, is 100% effective in killing mussels. So unfortunately that would be native mussels as well, but we don't have much for native mussels, but there are a few populations. So the Government of Alberta, with all our infrastructure invested in irrigation, we are taking on registering potash, the fertilizer, as a pesticide for use against invasive mussels. Lake Winnipeg, on their first detection, launched a response program under an emergency or under a research authorization to use this product. It was 100% effective, but they had already missed the opportunity to contain it. And it was already on the North Bay of Lake Winnipeg. And as the 9th largest freshwater lake. They didn't have enough money to do an entire lake treatment. So they did try and treat the South Bay where they first detected it, and were very effective in removing the mussels there, but it was just too much and they didn't catch it in time. So the Alberta government is pursuing this for our own interests, but hoping to make it available Canada-wide so that other folks can implement it and hopefully minimize our risk of getting invasive mussels here. Now to the fun stuff. So we're going to get into the specific on aquatic invasive species that I am dealing with year in and year out. So this is flowering rush. This was an much sought ornamental water pond plant. And now I am dealing with it in every water body type in the province. So it has been mishandled or intentionally released. And so now I'm trying to address it in lakes, rivers, creeks, streams, stormwater management ponds, irrigation canals, golf course hazard ponds, you name it, it's probably there. Some educational ponds at a Edmonton Public School location in Edmonton, managed to get some as well. So yeah, it's very tricky. There's no silver bullet. This picture is from Lake Isle, which is about an hour west of Edmonton. And it's by far the worst location in Alberta. I'm trying to address, it's up to 22 kilometers of shoreline. And in some areas like depicted here, it's about 20 meters thick. And you can pretty much almost walk on the water because flowering rush mats so well. Through some collaboration with the University of Calgary with a grad student, we've been able to determine that it's not reproducing by seed. So we are, have that to our advantage, but it does so well with vegetative reproduction. It does vegetative reproduction by rhizomes and actually produces little bulbules on the side of its roots that only need a little bit of disturbance to break off, and then will float away and quite easily establish. So this one is definitely very tricky to address, and it's been a slow process to try and get ahead of this one. And Saskatchewan is thanking me. We've actually shared it now through the South Saskatchewan, and it is now going to Saskatchewan, and they're trying to hold it at bay because they've seen the damage that it's doing in Alberta. So they're trying to stay on top of it as much as possible. It is a pretty plant, but yeah, it's going to be difficult. Thankfully, there's some biocontrol in the works, and hopefully that will help us get ahead of it. Another pond plant is this pale yellow iris, also known as yellow flag iris. Comes in this bright yellow or a pale white flower color. It's actually a poisonous plant. And we have a couple significant populations, one being in the Chestermere Golf Course, and then one location out west of Edmonton in the Wagner Natural Area. And again, not a lot of control options, but we do know that this one can be smothered for 3 months with a barrier, a rubber mat barrier, and it seems to be quite effective. So some of these populations are pretty extensive and hard to address that way, but we're doing what we can with the resources that we have and the weakness that we found in that it can be smothered.
Hey, Nicole.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. What is the responsibility of a place like Chestermere Golf Course or other commercial operations in terms of their responsibility for dealing with these invasive species that may actually came through their operation?
Yeah, so we're working with Chestermere Golf Course as much as possible to hold this population. They are trying to do barriers, but yeah, because it's listed as a prohibited species, possession is actually against the law, and any movement that you allow to happen can be basically charged. You can be charged as that. We don't have any really good solid control options, so The golf course is using barriers to try and work on the fringes and work its way in. They're cutting the seed pods on this one to stop seed production. So they are working with their best efforts, given their resources. So we're happy with what they've been doing. But yeah, we work closely to monitor what they're doing to make sure that it's the best approach to at least try and contain it as much as possible so that it doesn't flow down and end up in Chestermere, the reservoir.
Thanks.
So that's it for pale yellow iris. Purple loosestrife, this was like the invasive species poster child for Alberta. If you ask Albertans to name an invasive species, most likely they'll tell you about purple loosestrife. We had a huge campaign in the 1990s with Ducks Unlimited trying to eradicate purple loosestrife. We made a huge dent. It took about 10 years of programming to almost eradicate the population, but then the funding ran out, essentially, and so we still have a few isolated little populations still going. And then we had this one found late last year out by the Wainwright in their drainage pond for the city. So we quickly went out there this year and used herbicide to try and get a handle on it because it was quite extensive. And it was threatening to be introduced into the Battle River river system. So we needed to contain it in the drainage pond or the slough that it was occupying. The crazy thing about purple loosestrife is one plant, if we were, just to let it go for a year, one plant can produce in optimal conditions 2.5 million seeds. So it's a prolific seed producer. And so we really wanted to get onto that location as quick as possible to stop that seed production. But this one, unlike pale yellow iris and flowering rush, this one you can easily hand dig. The pale yellow iris and the flowering rush are a little bit more trickier. You have to get all the root fragments on the flowering rush and the pale yellow iris to make sure that it doesn't regrow. This one's more of a ball root, and you can kind of easily dig it up. And that's basically the approach that they took in the 90s. They had crews out hand digging and removing the purple loosestrife. From there, we go to Himalayan balsam. This plant was quite common in urban municipalities, towns and cities especially. It's known by many different names. It actually has exploding seed pods. So when those seed pods are mature, they will explode their seeds and can disperse them up to 10 meters away. And that's how they were getting into the drainage systems in towns and cities. They were getting washed down, and then we were finding them down in those drainage areas where they were thriving and doing quite well. They come in many shades of purple, anywhere from like this pale pink, almost white, to this deep, rich burgundy purple. So quite varied in color, but very devastating. It's only an annual, but it really dominates those riparian areas, outcompetes any of the natives, and then when it dies off, it opens those soils to erosion throughout the winter, where native plants would have been able to maintain that root system year round. Bees love this plant. They will land on those petals and crawl right into the flower. It does produce a lot of nectar that they seem to appreciate. So you will always see bees around it when it is flowering. It was put on the Weed Control Act in 2010, and then the Fisheries Act, which is my legislation, added it in 2015 as well. So we have two pieces of legislation on the Himalayan balsam trying to keep it at bay. This one can be easily hand pulled, and that's mostly the approach that we're taking in most locations that we're finding it. And thankfully, the Weed Control Act has been driving some removal 5 years ahead of my program. So we're in a pretty good state for Himalayan balsam, but we still find some pretty hefty locations of this plant from time to time. A new plant that we found in 2019 was yellow floating heart. This one, it was only in one isolated location. They actually purchased the pond plant in 2013, so 2 years before it was actually a prohibited species. But as soon as we put it on the act in 2015, it became a prohibited species, but they didn't know it at the time. So I got a call in 2019 saying, we have this plant in our water feature and it's overtaking the water feature. Can you help us manage it? And I said, well, what is it? And then they came clean that it was yellow floating heart. So we had a bit of a serious conversation because I said, I need to know about this and I need to help guide your response effort because this is a prohibited plant. And it had potential to go into the North Saskatchewan quite easily. So worked with the owner within the city of Edmonton to address this, and we just hand pulled our way out of this location. And they've been monitoring for 2 years now on the regrowth, and we've done pretty well at holding it. The next plant is Phragmites. This is as opposed to the other plants that we've covered, this is a grass species. It grows anywhere from 10 to 15 feet tall. It's a pretty extensive grass. Anybody from Eastern Canada knows this plant. Eastern Canada is now facing thousands of acres of Phragmites. They did not take the first introductions seriously and respond to it. So we're learning from their mistake and trying to keep our populations very, very small and contained and completely eradicate them. We have a pretty good system of cutting these and then applying some herbicide. And we're working closely with the two culprits that are depicted here. Both CN and CP both have populations. It seems to love to ride the rails from Eastern Canada. So all you need is a fragment or seed to be picked up on a train, and then it's coming out west. So we're working with CN and CP to keep on all those locations. The complicating thing is that there's also a native Phragmites, and it's a little bit hard to tell apart the native from the invasive. So if you think you've seen a population, let me know. We'll go out, get a sample, run the DNA, and then we can determine for sure without a doubt if it's the invasive type or not. A new one from 2019 as well, we detected Chinese mystery snail in Lake McGregor. So that is the only location that we know of. BC has a few locations of Chinese mystery snail, so we suspect that it might have come from BC on a boat, since it was found radiating from the boat launch at Lake McGregor recreational area. This is a pretty substantial snail. That's my hand holding it there. It can grow as tall as 6 centimeters and is pretty wide compared to our native snails. So you can't mistake it for our native snails. We've done some research with local folks and the local Fish and Wildlife officers, and we believe that the snails probably have been in that location since 2015, and we do have photographic evidence from 2016. So they've been there quite a while before we actually were notified and somebody realized what they actually were. But something really cool happened from the detection. Since this was the only location of Chinese mystery snail at Lake McGregor, we were able to leverage some tools with some creative partnerships to actually encourage people to clean their boats and hopefully contain, since it's only the one location. And so we were the first jurisdiction in Canada to bring this machine, which is called a CD3 machine, to Canada. And so it is now in our possession, and we'll be putting it back out at Lake McGregor next year. With maneuvering import and COVID, we actually didn't receive it until the Labor Day long weekend. So we had a pretty limited season of launching, and we weren't able to get out there and really promote it with the public for use. But it offers an air compressor, a vacuum, a picker tool, a brush, and a boat bilge plug remove tool. It is solar powered. I'm getting real data. You can log on to the system. It is sending us how many times somebody grabs and uses the air compressor versus the the vacuum and all the tools, turns on the light. There's some light so you can use it at night. And so this is pretty innovative. Lots of folks have been interested in how we got it and you know, all the steps and on how it's being used. So we probably won't be the only one having it in Alberta or Canada for very much longer. Other folks are lining up to get this tool that really enables people to clean, drain, and dry their boat and equipment upon exit. I wanted to cover some fish as well. So black bullhead is a prohibited species. This was the perfect alliance of a prohibited species and, you know, federal regulations coming into play that gave us powers to respond. So we detected black bullhead in 2015, right after we were able to get our legislation passed. And so we had full authority to respond to it. So somebody had obviously, we suspect, maybe driven black bullhead from Eastern Canada, a breeding pair, and introduced them into a pond up in Fort McMurray that was isolated and was stocked with other fish. Upon detection, we closed the area to all public access. We fenced it off, actually had security guards posted to ensure that nobody was going to go in there and you know, take a couple fish out to move to another location. And then we were able to launch a response effort where we were able to use rotenone, which is a plant-based chemical that actually stops fish from breathing through their gills. So it only affects fish. And so we salvaged as much as we could of the trout beforehand, before the treatment, did a treatment, and then monitored for 2 years, didn't find any more black bullhead. And so we were able to restock that pond with trout. So this is one of the big success stories, and really the big you know, feather in our caps of our program happened very early on, and we've sort of, you know, ridden the high of this success, but it was no small feat and had, you know, the perfect alliance of legislation and folks being able to help us out with that. Another detection for 2020, we work closely with the Canadian Border Service Agency, and so they are somewhat familiar with our prohibited list as a province. Federally, we only have 5 species that are prohibited for import. So I did get notification from Canadian Border Services Agency. I forget what day, what month it was. I think it was in June, that they said that we detected somebody imported Oriental weather loach through the pet trade industry. And we do know that that's prohibited in Alberta. So we were able to follow up with them and figure out the distributor. I don't have any powers to seize anything myself, so I had to go out with a Fish and Wildlife officer, and we were able to find 40 Oriental weather loaches that were imported unknowingly as a prohibited species. So we confiscated them and euthanized them to ensure that they didn't end up anywhere else. So yeah, things do come in. The pet distributor was given a warning because he didn't know. And so now that we've had a serious conversation with him and given him the entire prohibited list, if he is found with anything else that's been imported, we'll probably charge him because he now knows better, and we can prove it through those warnings. And it just proves that relationship with the Canadian Border Service Agency does pay off dividends in catching that, because otherwise I would have never known if it wasn't on their radar.
Say, Nicole.
Yes.
What relationship do you have with the pet trade in terms of these aquatic invasive species? Like, do you have a educational program to let them know what you're concerned about, or how does that work?
Yeah, we've been able to do a couple mail outs. I think we've done 2 mail outs since 2015, where we basically said, here's a poster of Don't Let It Loose, some stickers. We have some quick fact cards, little pamphlet cards. We've given them prohibited list and kind of advised them, you know, their authorities. There just isn't a real good organization that encompasses them all. There's a lot of mom and pop pet stores out there. So we've done the mail out route twice now, being pretty, passive information sharing. Yeah, we're trying to work on a national level to try and hit the bigger distributors like your PetSmart and Petland, those bigger named ones, as much as possible. But yeah, we don't have very good connections so far. Okay, so that wraps up our prohibited list. So those are species that are specifically listed in our Fisheries Alberta Act as prohibited species. So they're prohibited to import, transport, and possess. We still have other species of concern that fall outside of that prohibited list that we still have invested interest in because they do threaten our native species in our aquatic systems. So we work outside of that prohibited list quite often. So some other species of concern that we operate with are Prussian carp. This is a very close relative of goldfish, and we suspect that they probably came in through a shipment of goldfish and were released, much like goldfish are, and now are thriving. So Prussian carp can reproduce up to 3 times in a season. So highly prolific. Our natives are usually only doing one spawning event in a summer. They can live outside of water, without water, for 24 hours. Some of our bios, we're netting some, left them out, and just to, out of curiosity, thought they'd throw them back in water and see if they survived. And it was near 24 hours, and then it started coming back, back to life, per se. So we're the only jurisdiction really, now we've shared it with Saskatchewan as well, that's facing this species in North America. For whatever reason, Alberta is ground zero for the Prussian carp introduction into North America. So yay for us for winning that trophy, but we're really leading the way on this species, trying to address it as best we can. Anything that we can take out Prussian carp with will also take out all our other native sport fish as well. So it's a difficult species to address. So they're quite prolific in the Bow River, the Rosebud, the Red Deer River, and the South Saskatchewan River. A close relative is goldfish. So contrary to urban myth, people think that flushing their fish is how goldfish are getting out into Alberta. That is not the case. This is people intentionally taking their aquariums down to lake waters and dumping their goldfish in. We do need 2 breeding. Oh, that was the other thing I forgot to mention on Prussian carp. We only need one female to be introduced because this species can take the sperm of related cyprinid species and use that sperm to clone their eggs. So they're not actually fertilizing their eggs, but they're completing the development process so that they can actually clone themselves. So only one female fish needs to be introduced to start a whole new population. Goldfish, we actually need a male and a female. So we do need that pair of 2s. So in some cases, we found goldfish, but they haven't fully established, thankfully. I am still facing over 70 locations of goldfish in Alberta. They will grow up to dinner-sized plate size. They are very opportunistic. They will eat anything they can fit in their mouth, whether it be frogs, snails, plants, smaller fish. They're pretty adaptable. And they start out gold or orange, but once they start reproducing quite prolifically in the wild, they actually lose their coloration and start having more of a silvery black appearance, which makes them look a lot like Prussian carp. So in some cases, we have to send them for testing to make sure that we have Prussian carp versus goldfish, because they are that closely related. And we did just catch this one. So that's me standing with that big goldfish. Just in October, we were down in Lethbridge collecting some footage and pictures of goldfish, trying to get the story out through COVID-19 restrictions, and doing it through virtual means of sharing that story. So it is definitely a worldwide problem. There's multiple jurisdictions. BC just detected another pond that they're trying to address before it freezes up with goldfish. So Alberta is not unique in this, but we're doing pretty good in trying to spread the message and keep on top of the goldfish as much as possible.
So Nicole?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just got a question on the chat line related to what you're discussing about goldfish. The question is, do goldfish overwinter easily?
Yes. Yes. So we found goldfish all the way up into Fort McMurray, Peace River regions, where they can get long stints of cold weather. They do just fine. Even if we dewater them, they seem to bury, and they can go into this a hibernation state called torpor, where they actually slow the metabolic rate and can do just fine in cold temperatures. So yeah, usually winter is the saving grace on some of our invasive species, but not for goldfish. They do just fine. Much like goldfish, we are addressing koi fish being released as well. Thankfully, not as much. This is not as big of a problem as goldfish, but we did get some pretty good media attention a few years ago when this boy with his grandpa caught this 16-pound koi fish in St. Albert using hot dog as a bait. So this was the same pond that St. Albert was already in the works to address their goldfish population in. So they did do a treatment of rotenone. That's that chemical that stops the fish from breathing. So they were already in the works to treat that water body, and they actually pulled out an 18-pound koi when they did their treatment. So that's Melissa with the city of St. Albert holding that great big beautiful koi fish. So some pretty impressive fish have been found. Right after this story aired, I remember in Japan there was like a $1 million koi being sold on an auction or something. I'm like, oh, I could have made so much money for my program if I just saved all those big koi. So yeah. And another ornamental pet fish that's being found in a few locations, we've only had a couple reports, but rosy red minnows, often a feeder fish, are also being found in a few water bodies. And this is very closely related to the fathead minnow, but usually has this orange-red variation, and so they get coined with rosy red minnows. So much like the goldfish and the koi, being released intentionally to establish. We are still dealing with whirling disease. So this is a fish disease detected in 2016. They had a whole entire program develop around this detection, but only had 3 years of funding. And now that funding has ended and it doesn't look like it's being renewed. So whirling disease is sort of starting to fall underneath my program somewhat. There is no control measure. We can't stop it. So they've really joined forces with our campaign of clean, drain, dry your gear, because that's the only mitigation for whirling disease, is trying to minimize the spread. We are seeing some pretty significant impacts in the Crow's Nest River, and it's starting to flow down. So unfortunately, that was introduced and is now thriving in 4 watersheds. It's been introduced, so we're continuing to try and minimize the spread as much as possible. We are addressing northern crayfish. So initially we thought northern crayfish were probably native to the Beaver watershed. So that includes like just north of Wainwright, the Riley area. And we had protections around that area, so stopping people from harvesting any crayfish in the Beaver watershed. Since then, we found northern crayfish all the way to Whitecourt, all the way down to like Milk River, Medicine Hat, It's thriving in Calgary, in the Bow River and the Nose Creek. You can easily find crayfish. So we are concerned about this species. It's not the only crayfish that we're concerned with. So we're encouraging folks to send us pictures of crayfish so that we can help identify. We're worried about some other ones from other jurisdictions, like your rusty and your red swamp crayfish that we believe would probably be able to establish and overwinter here. We're worried about some pet trade crayfish. There's a marbled crayfish in the pet trade that actually can clone itself. So just one species, and we think that it probably could overwinter in Alberta as well. So we're encouraging folks to share locations and pictures. We have added this on to EdMaps, if not yet, in the near future, very near future, so we can help track it through that citizen science smartphone application as well. But yeah, these crayfish do get quite substantial, and we're shifting regulations to ease the use or the harvest of them, but we are very strict on transporting any live crayfish. We recently just fined a few individuals that were found with live crayfish in their possession, more than a meter away from the water body. So if you're going to take any crayfish away from a water body, make sure it's dead. Otherwise you can get charged, because we are worried about that live transfer and introducing it into another water body.
Say, Nicole?
Yes.
Just another question related to crayfish. Are the crayfish introduced or just enlarging their range? I guess that's referring to the northern crayfish.
Yeah, so our definition of aquatic invasive species can include native species that are expanding range faster than what we would normally anticipate normal expansion would be. So we sort of think that's applying to northern crayfish. So yes, we think northern crayfish are definitely native to Alberta, but we do have concerns that folks are either using them as bait or moving them around. So we do have concerns, and we're sort of treating them as a species of concern. We're keeping an eye on them. And because they are closely resemble other species that would be definitely invasive as well, we're trying to get people to share information that they encounter on the crayfish. And that brings me to the end of kind of the species. So yeah, no short list or anything. It does keep me busy year round. So I'm already wrapping up response efforts from 2020 and starting to plan what we're going to do in 2021 for sure. There's always still work to do. So we're still trying to change those behaviors. We're still finding folks that are draining boats near drainage systems. Who knows what this boat was carrying, and is now introducing it into the municipal water system. And they can't necessarily take out all the disease pathogens and species that we're concerned with. We're still not getting the compliance that we would like to see around pulling the plug. So we're looking to try and promote boaters to make sure that that boat plug is removed so that all that water is draining out and is not being introduced into other water bodies. And we are seeing firsthand evidence of people dumping aquariums. So this is a water body actually out by Chestermere, where I was doing a survey for Flowering Rush and happened to stumble upon some aquarium, beautiful blue and white rocks that was along the shoreline that is easily accessible from public to that bridge just above it. So someone obviously came down with their aquarium, dumped it in, and those fancy rocks also fell out. So I know exactly where it was dumped. I just don't know what was introduced. So I'll probably find it later on, unfortunately. So still more work to do, changing those behaviors with Albertans. But hopefully, if you have taken any message home, it's all these creative partnerships that tackle aquatic invasive species in Alberta. I am one of 2 full-time employees with the government trying to tackle all these issues. I don't do it alone. So many people are involved, spreading the message, sending in reports, promoting as much as possible. what you need to do around aquatic invasive species, and hopefully your group can help do that for me. And that's it. Any questions that I didn't cover? Here's my email, my phone numbers. If you have any other further questions or want to get into contact with me about something specific.
Well, thanks there, Nicole. I got a couple of questions that came in on the chat line.
Sure.
The first one that came in was, what do you say to the people who say invasive species are inevitable, like they'll be normal, you're going to get them in our connected world, that we should just get used to it? This is how life naturally evolves.
Yeah, so that does come up a lot in the invasive species world. From my point of view, there would probably be some stabilization eventually with aquatic invasive species. Aquatic environments are pretty sensitive to change though. That stabilization, and once it, you know, settled into an invasive species introduction, is going to be a long process. And since humans are usually the culprit that enabled the introduction, I think we owe it to the environment to try and minimize those impacts as much as possible.
Good. Another question is, what is the status of the so-called rock snot that covers over the rocks in the bedrock of the streams?
Yeah, so it's also known as Didymo. It is a species of concern, but I just don't have the resources to fully address it. But it is definitely, we're sort of, you know, monitoring as much as possible just through anecdotal reports, but we're not actively surveilling or monitoring for it. So it's pretty limited. It is on our radar, and as well as other jurisdictions are also keeping an eye on it, but we're not actively pursuing any response efforts on it to date.
Okay. One question came up, I think, when you were talking about the crayfish. Are they active in the wintertime?
No, they go into sort of a habitat state. They go into, I don't know if it's if they hibernate or torpor. I can't remember exactly, but no, they're not active during the winter.
Okay, good to know. One question we had is, for plants such as the Himalayan balsam, do the cities of Calgary and Edmonton take some of the responsibility for the eradication of those species?
Yeah, so if it expands past private property and somehow infiltrates the common space for the city of Edmonton or Calgary, they do have active programs, and they do quite often inspect and entice private landowners to respond to Himalayan balsam as much as possible. Both, I know you can actively, so Edmonton has 311, I think you have 211 down in Calgary. They will actively take down reports of Himalayan balsam and respond to them.
Good to know. Do you recruit volunteers to scout areas or help in control efforts?
It's not anything we've explored recently. We had some change in process within the government of Alberta handling volunteers. So that was sort of undergoing review. I think it's sort of stabilized, so there might be opportunity. Much of my response efforts are pretty low manpower requirements based on, you know, only having a few limited staff at my disposal. So if the opportunity arose, yeah, I would probably try and entertain the idea as much as possible.
In that regard, I was wondering if so you say there is some sort of a pamphlet or a brochure about invasive species of concern that the public can get access to?
I actually have a pamphlet for every species I covered tonight on the prohibited list, and even some of the species of concern.
Okay. Is that available from a website of some sort?
Yeah, I can point you in the right direction. I will.
Okay, we could share that with our members.
I will share a link with you onto all our information online.
Okay, great. It sounds good to me.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just see, what else do we have here? Oh, there was a question about, you had a slide that showed the distribution of the species that you're concerned about.
Mhm.
Can that be shared at all, or could that be maybe added to our website, or could people access it just by contacting your office?
I will also, when I share you a link of our website, I will share you the attachment of that Alberta poster. And I also have a zoomed in one of Calgary that might be of
Yeah,
better perspective. I will share that as well.
that would be good.
I'll start writing these down.
See if we got anything else here that coming up for questions. Just certainly some nice comments saying that it was a great presentation. Learned a lot.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, so it's something else for us as naturalists to be aware of. Instead of looking up into the trees for birds, we can look down into the water and see what's happening in that environment.
Yeah, you'll be surprised what you can see.
I can imagine. No, so there are no mermaids. Is that?
I haven't found any yet. That would be really kind of a highlight of my career, I think, if I.
Yeah, it'd be kind of fun to see sometime.
I wouldn't tell anyone. I would protect
okay.
it and be quiet.
A question just popped up. Are the aquarium species in the cave and basin regarded as invasive?
The aquatic invasive species in
Aquarium,
the cave.
the aquarium species that are dumped in the cave and basin ponds in Banff.
That's a snail, correct?
Oh, well, no, there is actually down below the cave and basin pool, there's a wetland. And if you go to a viewing platform, you can look down into the waters and see these basically exotic fishes that people have dumped in there with their like red mollies and various things. So those would be, I would imagine, invasive species within.
Yeah. So if they weren't if they were purposely introduced, they could be considered an invasive species. But the national parks actually fall outside of my jurisdiction, so I'm not completely familiar with that location.
That brings up an interesting question. So an invasive species is a little bit more of a designation other than just a non-native. Is it possible to have a non-native species but is not invasive and therefore would not be of your concern?
Yes. So species are elevated to invasive if they cause environmental, economic, or society harm. That's sort of the definition of invasive species. So sometimes things get introduced but are pretty benign and don't threaten anything. They don't quite meet the invasive species standard.
Okay.
And I can't think of any examples off the top of my head.
Interesting. Okay. If there's any other questions, you can put them on the chat line, or I think you can actually go to your the taskbar down at the bottom of the screen and then swing your cursor over to the mute, the microphone thing. It's either mute or you can unclick it and it would allow you to ask your question without going through the chat line. Other than that, certainly on behalf of Nature Calgary, I'd love to thank you for a great presentation there, Nicole. Thanks. Something that we don't really tend to look at on a normal basis, but that's the purpose of our speaker series, is to branch out into other aspects of natural history and to learn about it. So it was great that you're able to take the time to help us out. And certainly on behalf of the club, hope you have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Same to you.
Yeah, and we'll look forward maybe to some future engagements with your operation in some fashion. So sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so that sort of concludes our meeting tonight. Just as another thing with the COVID thing, I did mention that our field trips are paused right now till January 15th, but I do anticipate that we'll be doing our Zoom meetings quite likely into the late spring, depending on what's going on with COVID. So get used to it, I suppose. It'd be very nice to have you guys, see you in person, but I don't know if that's going to happen for a little bit of time. So take care, and we'll be in touch again. So again, January the 20th, Andrew Hart will be taking us on a trip down to India and the Western Ghats. So I hope you can participate in that meeting. February, we have a meeting with a person from the Provincial Museum talking about the Ice Age mammals that existed in Alberta. In our March talk, we'll be having a person from Canada's country, the ecology program, talking about their programs of studies within Canada's country, their camera programs, that sort of thing. In April, we have a person talking about bees. And then in May, we'll have a person from the Nature Conservancy of Canada talking about all their operations in southern Alberta. So hope you can make all those meetings. And other than that, take care, stay safe, and we'll be doing this again. So goodbye, everybody.
Bye.